So good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's first of many HSI public lectures. And it is a part of our ongoing HSI efforts and initiatives here at UC Santa Cruz. So for those that don't know, in 2012, UCSC was designated a Hispanic Serving Institution, and that's more than 25% of undergraduates. And then the campus applied for grants, right? And we received two that totaled $3.6 million. And then we received another one from the U.S. Department of Education, which is a $5.7 million grant. Now, there's a lot of funding and a lot of money, right? And numbers. But there's a lot of theory and practice and corazón involved in these grants as well. So UCSC is an ongoing conversation, and today that's the conversation that we'll be leading. And it is in regards to the Latinx-Serving Institution, beyond the grant funding, okay? And the public lecture today by Dr. Garcia will serve to extend this conversation. And before that, I really want to emphasize that this is an effort in regards to highlighting already the existing things that are happening. So, for example, El Centro, the center that I direct, the Chicana Latino Research Center, was funded in 1995 and has done a lot of these efforts and initiatives already. We just aligned it with our HSI initiatives. I, myself, Dr. Judith Estrada, pronouns she, her, hers, am an alum from UC Santa Cruz, very proud of it, and I've seen a lot of the change. Now as a director, I serve and I work with students to provide a space for them to feel that they're affirmed not only as human beings, but also as scholars, new scholars in the field, okay? With leadership now, so we have students, community, faculty, staff, and leadership too. I want to also congratulate Pablo Reguerin, our Associate Vice Chancellor of Student Achievement and Equity Innovation, because we need a leader to really lead these efforts and really put us on the map, okay? And because of his efforts, we have been able to have these grants, but not only that, but really implement them and sustain them and have that as a thread through the university. So I want to invite him, and he will give a few words and also introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Gina A. Garcia.
Thank you. I really think the power of our HSI initiatives has been as a result of a partnership and a larger collective. So it really is a collective group of many people, and we're always happy to have more people join the HSI team, the UCSC HSI team. I want to thank you all for coming, first of all, again, to the inaugural HSI Initiatives public lecture hosted by El Centro, the Chicano Latino Resource Center. And I want to thank and recognize Dr. Judith Estrada, who's been reaching out to scholars across the country with the goal of informing an ongoing dialogue about who we are as a campus, the changing demographics, the evolution of UC Santa Cruz, and how we grapple with racial equity, and where we stand as an institution in serving Latinos, communities of color, and creating transformative experiences for historically excluded communities. Today, we're honored to hear from Dr. Gina A. Garcia, one of the most prestigious scholars in the field and one of the most prolific writers tackling challenging issues in educational equity and higher education, and also holding the higher education community accountable for serving Latino students. As a leading scholar in this area, Dr. Garcia, again, has very much challenged the higher education community to examine itself and uses organizational theory to help make sense of how institutions struggle with identity. I really admire Dr. Garcia's courage to call out HSIs that are quick to celebrate what she calls the manufactured identity and pushes higher education leaders to think deeply about the daily experiences of students to help define how they see themselves and how they construct their identity. Dr. Garcia has called for increased investment in HSIs and has shown through her studies and proven empirically that funding matters when it comes to increasing graduation rate for Latinos and Latino students, and that we actually need to invest more, not disinvest. I've got to know Dr. Garcia through her research, and this is one of the, I think the second time I've met her personally, but it's really an honor when you get when you get to read someone's work, and I want to share with you a little bit about, I want to share a little bit of her work. And so I'm going to just read some of the titles of her studies. And these are just from 2015, 2016, 2017, and it's a partial list. So one of her studies titled, Defined by Outcomes or Culture, Constructing an Organizational Identity for Hispanic Serving Institutions. Contexts that matter to the leadership development of Latino male college students, a mixed methods perspective. Exploring curricular and co-curricular effects on civic engagement at emerging HSIs. The convergence of social identities and environmental contexts in facilitating Latino male resilience. Decolonizing HSIs. Complicating a Latina serving identity at an HSI. Identity salience for Latino male collegians at an HSI. Challenging the utility of racial microaggressions framework through a systemic review of racially biased incidents on campus. Institutional agency at an HSI using social capital to empower students. Exploring student affairs professionals' experiences with the campus racial climate at an HSI. And culturally relevant practices that serve, quote unquote, students at a Hispanic serving institution. So as you can see, and as you just heard, there's a number of studies and writing and thinking that Dr. Garcia has done in pushing campuses to strive at serving their students, and clearly is one of the most relevant thinkers and writers on the potential of HSIs to transform higher education. On a personal note, I want to share that Dr. Garcia has impacted my own identity as a Latino, as a higher education leader, and as a scholar. In her article, Institutional Agency at a Hispanic Serving Institution, she talks about using social capital. And so those of us that are leaders, those of us that might be considered what is called a high status agent that has access to resources and power, to use your social capital on behalf of marginalized students and communities. And then if we're truly to serve students, that we all must do that. And we all have levels of power. And I think for me, it was one of the first times I read something where I said, this is congruent with who I am as a person, with my thinking, with my heart, and has continued to serve as a compass for me in this work. And so I want to thank Dr. Garcia for giving me language and giving me a framework to really challenge how we are as an institution and to serve those that are the most vulnerable in our community. So please join me in a round warm of applause for Dr. Gina A. Garcia.
I don't need that. I have this. Oh, which I think has fallen off of me. So we've been having microphone problems, so we're going to try our best. There. Is it on? No? But it's not on. Oh. I might have to just hold the mic. It might be a better way. But then it'll go, take away from my Britney Spears look. Does it look? Yeah? Okay. And I got this, fashionable belt that's, holding it on, so it's, part of my outfit now, all right? It looks good, right? I think it looks good. Okay, I'll take it. Thank you for those wonderful words, and thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. Before I get into the empirical stuff and talking about all the research on HSIs and get y'all to start to think about what that means and complicating that, I like to sort of just talk to you about why I do this work, right? So I am largely a qualitative researcher. I do quantitative work as well, but I do a lot of qualitative work. And in qualitative research, we center ourselves in the research, right? The research is part of who we are, and we're part of the research, right? And so talking about who we are as people before we do research is important, right? And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself because I always think, people write me and they probably think, okay, wait, she's at the University of Pittsburgh, and if you know anything about the University of Pittsburgh, it's the whitest campus ever, okay? Seriously, it's really super white there, the city is super white, and I'm from California, so I notice all that, right? I'm this place, how did this place get stuck, in the 1970s and hasn't really progressed racially? And so, you think, what does she know about HSIs, right? She's from the whitest university in the US, or one of the whitest universities. So I talk a little bit about my undergraduate experience. I'll tell you about how I identify. I identify as Chicana. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I graduated from Cal State University Northridge, which at the time was an emerging HSI. I didn't know that it was an emerging HSI. Many of your students on this campus do not know it's an HSI, right? We know that, right? You could ask 10 students walking down the street, how many of them know it's an HSI, and 2 might know, right? And a lot of them are in the room, right? Those of you that are in the room actually know. So that's important, right? Because my work really gets into whether or not people have to actually know about the federal designation, right? That like what you do on a daily basis is actually more important than the federal designation, right? It's a federal designation, all right? It means things to the federal government and to the university at high levels, but otherwise, what does it mean for students? Probably not a lot, right? So I graduated from Cal State University Northridge, and I had a really transformative experience that I really thought about later on down the road, right? That I thought about, well, what happened during my undergraduate experience that was so transformative, right? And I related a lot back to the fact that we were at the time an emerging HSI, and now Cal State Northridge has been an HSI for probably like 20 years, right? It's been an HSI for quite some time. I then worked on an HSI grant, a Title V grant at Cal State University Fullerton. And so I thought my undergraduate experience was really great, and I really enjoyed being there. And then I got to Cal State Fullerton, and I had to implement this grant, right? This Title V grant, which y'all have 3 wonderful grants going on right now. I learned all about them a little while ago. And it was frustrating because I didn't know what that meant, right? I was like, I don't know what it means to be an HSI. I don't know why we got this like $2.5 million from the federal government. I don't even know what to do, and why am I all by myself doing this work, right? Like I was straight out of a master's program, and I felt very alone, like trying to do this work and not really having a lot of buy-in from the institution and not really knowing what it meant to be an HSI, right? So that led me into my doctoral program, which when I got to the doctoral program, I got to start to ask those questions, right? And I sort of balanced out these experiences with HSI where I was like, well, I think HSIs are good, right? Like I went to one and I had a really great transformative experience, but then I tried to work on this grant and I felt like at the university level, there were some structural barriers, right? Like to like becoming really Hispanic serving or Latinx serving, right? And so I had these different experiences that I bring to my work, right? And so that's where I'm at in thinking about a lot of the things that I think about, right? And a lot of the things that I write about, which I'm going to share with y'all some of those things and some of the most current empirical work, including stuff that's not published yet. So y'all get to see what I'm thinking about right now before it's even published. So if you're a Twitter user, you can follow me on Twitter. My what is that thing called? Handle, yeah, I was like, it's called something. My Twitter handle is up there at Gina A Garcia. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Feel free to say things that I say, but only if they're really profound, all right? You gotta be really profound and in 140 characters, all right? But there's my Twitter handle. If you wanna follow me, feel free. I will follow up when I'm done with the public lecture. So, before we get into all the research, I always like to do a recognition of the land. And Judith, thank you for sending me this. This is the formal recognition that UC Santa Cruz recognizes that we are on indigenous land, we are on colonized land. And I think it's important, particularly because I do have this article called Decolonizing HSIs, right? And what is this idea of actually going back to this way of thinking that like before, right? Before universities were founded as oppressive spaces, as grounded in colonialism. And so in order to get to a university where we are anti-colonialism, anti-whiteness, anti-all the oppressive sort of ways of thinking, we have to recognize that we are on indigenous lands, right? So thank you for sending me the recognition of the land, and we must always recognize that the land that we're on. Does it change? Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this like little bubble in Prezi because y'all are here. So I assume y'all know what an HSI is, right? I sometimes have to really give people a lot of like what I call HSI 101, but I think y'all are beyond HSI 101. Y'all know what an HSI is at the basic level, right? But just so you know, HSIs are increasing their percentage of all post-secondary institutions every year by about a percentage. This actually, I believe, is outdated. I think we're now at like 14%, and every year we're seeing the number of HSIs increasing dramatically, right? And there's also a large number of emerging HSIs. So we know that the number is going to continue to increase and that HSIs are going to continue to be important, right, within the larger post-secondary landscape, right? So this is an important area, an important thing for us to be thinking about. They enroll about 62% of Latinx students, right, which makes sense because they're enrollment-driven institutions. So, of course, they enroll a large percentage of the population, right? So they're pretty significant. If you haven't ever visited Excellencia in Education's website, I encourage you to go there. They have so much data on HSIs and Latinx college students as well. So that's where that infographic comes from. I get a lot of my just basic information about HSIs from Excellencia. So definitely spend some time on their website if you never have. So a lot of my work gets into this idea of like the fact that HSIs don't really have a core identity. right? They're an additional identity to all your other identities, right? And so they're institutionally diverse, they're public, they're private, they're 2-year, they're 4-year, they're Catholic, they're all sorts of things, right? All sorts of things, and then they become HSIs, right? The HSI thing becomes a later identity, right? Which is why we're grappling so much with like, well, what does it mean to be an HSI? Because it wasn't an original identity, right? It's not like an HBCU in any sort of way, right? A historically black college or university. I have people all the time, hands down, every single lecture I give, somebody asks me to compare HSIs to HBCUs, and I won't do it, right? HBCUs are very specific. They were founded at a time when black folks could not get into universities, right? They were founded because segregation was alive and well, and black folks couldn't go to universities, right? So HBCUs had a very particular role, an important role in providing access, right? So HBCUs and HSIs, not the same thing at all, right? HSIs are all sorts of other things, and then they're also HSIs, right? So that's important, right? Because that's why we're struggling with this identity, right? And a lot of my work is around identity, right? Organizational identity. And this is why, because we don't really know who we are, what we originally intended to be, because it wasn't an original intention, right? So they historically lack a mission, and essentially what a lot of the literature calls out is that these are white institutions that now enroll a large percentage of racially minoritized students, right? That's what an HSI is. But at our core, at the structures, we haven't actually shifted to be an HSI, right? That's the big criticism. Is like, okay, just because you enroll a lot of people of color doesn't mean you serve them, right? That's the core argument, right? And I see y'all shaking your heads. Y'all know the core argument, right? So this is where my work sort of comes in, and with each article that I publish, I'm like, well, maybe it's this. Well, maybe it's that. I don't know, maybe it's this, right? Like, and so I keep sort of doing this maybe, right? Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And that's what I'm going to share with you, some of the maybes, right? Like, here's some things to think about as an institution that is really actively thinking about what this identity is. Let's see what else I got here. Profile of students, I think, is important for us to recognize that HSIs, the profile of students is different than a traditionally white institution, right? And that's important. And in some of my work, I argue, well, we're expecting HSIs to do certain things without recognizing who their population is, right? So you got students of color, you got low-income students, you got first-generation students, you got undocumented students, you got students who have what I would say been marginalized through the whole educational pipeline, right? The fact that these students even got to college and made it into the university is actually almost a miracle, because the entire educational system has never been provided or set up for them, right? Like the students that make it here, this system wasn't for you. Your K through 12 system, not for you, right? So the fact that they're here, that's a success to begin with, right? And that's one of the things I argue about HSIs. It's like, well, providing access to a population that wouldn't otherwise have access to higher education is important. That's an important thing, right? Let's not say that HSIs that only provide access to minoritized populations are bad, right? That's an important endeavor, to provide access to a population that has been historically minoritized, right, and marginalized, right? So that's important. We got to think about our students before we can think about putting all kinds of like labels on the institution of serving or not serving, right? Like, who are we serving and how do we serve them effectively, right? So I like to go through the profile because I think it's important. So in looking at the literature, this is like just sort of a quick snapshot of some of the literature out there. If you want to look into some of the literature, these are some of the folks who are writing about HSIs. So as I got into the literature and really started doing this work, what I found was that people weren't really actually defining what it means to be an HSI, but they were. Right? So they weren't asking the kind of questions I'm asking, like, what does it mean to be an HSI? But they were making claims about being an HSI based on the research, right? So outcomes was a big thing, right? There's a lot of claims in the research about whether or not you're an HSI based on the outcomes that you provide, right? Primarily academic. Right? So if you graduate students, and people started getting into if you graduate students in equitable numbers, right? So Latinx students and white students graduate in equitable numbers, then you're an HSI, right? And so people are making these claims, right? And that starts getting people thinking, well, that's the only way to be an HSI, right? So if you're not graduating students in equitable numbers, you're not an HSI, right? That's basically what this literature is saying, right? And I have the plus and the minus and the equal, because it's like these studies were showing differences between HSIs and non-HSIs, right? And some were saying non-HSIs have higher outcomes, and some say it balances out, and some were saying, no, HSIs are not doing well because they're not graduating Latinx students in equitable numbers, right? So there's a lot of different studies that have looked at that, right? We also got folks that are looking at non-academic outcomes, right? So this is folks that are saying, well, maybe there's other ways to be an HSI. Maybe it's not just about those academic outcomes, but maybe civic engagement or civic participation is important, right? And me and my colleague, Marcela Cuellar, we've done some of that work, right? They're like, well, what do you want your students to be civically engaged when they leave? Maybe it's important to graduate them, yes. All colleges and universities want to graduate their students, but what else, right? What do students that graduate from HSIs do also, right? Do they get more engaged? Do they go get engaged in their communities? Do they go back home to their homes, wherever their homes are, right, where there's probably a larger Latinx population, and engage in the community, right? Is that an important outcome for you as an HSI? If it is, think about that, right? And think about whether or not you're providing those opportunities, right? Racial ethnic identity salience, right? There's a lot of work out there that says college is a great place for people to think about who they are racially, right? I would say, me personally, I did a lot of that when I was an undergrad, right? I was taking Chicana studies. I was like, yes, right? Like, yes, power to the people, right? For the first time, I got to see myself in the curriculum, right? And so maybe that's important as well, right? But are you effectively doing that? Right? That's a place where you start to look at, like, are we effectively doing that on our campus? Are we providing spaces for people to think about their identity, right? And their multiple identities, right? Lots of different identities that they could be thinking about. Academic self-concept, engagement, there's all these different non-academic outcomes that folks, my colleagues, are saying, yes, HSIs do a better job of this. Right? So this is one continuum. I'm going to show you this like typology. This is one part of the axis. This is one axis that like HSIs got to produce outcomes, right? We're never going to say that institutions shouldn't graduate students, right? They should. They absolutely should. And that's not a bad thing, right? But what else? That's where some of my questions are at. Oh, wait, go back. Darn it. Oh. See, I got to point it at the computer and not at the screen. Profile, outcomes, culture. Oh. Prezi, gotta love Prezi. It sometimes does its own thing. Okay, so then culture. There's folks that my colleagues on this slide talk about culture at an HSI. Again, these folks were not saying, what does it mean to be an HSI? And if you do these things, you're an HSI. But that's how I classify it, right? That's how I classify the literature. That I'm like, well, pretty much what they're saying, that like the campus culture matters, right? So some folks are talking about you got to have Latinx faculty and staff on campus, right? That makes you an HSI. You got to have people that speak Spanish. That makes you an HSI. You got to provide spaces for students to interact in multiple languages, right? That makes you an HSI, right? So we got folks writing about that. Sense of belonging. We talked about sense of belonging earlier in our meeting. Institutional agency, right? Thank you for talking about the institutional agency piece, because when y'all talked to me today about your programs, that's what I was thinking. I was like, so much institutional agency going on this campus, right? Folks that understand you got to disrupt oppressive systems in order to better serve students, right? You need some pretty conscious administrators on campus to be able to do that, right? And I would argue they don't have to be racially minoritized people. White people can do that too, right? So if you're a white person in this room and you believe in disrupting oppressive systems for racially minoritized students, yes, absolutely, you should be a part of the conversation, right? Because you have the power to be an institutional agent, right? In a really important way. So all folks should be thinking about how they are institutional agents and use their capital to disrupt the normative way of being on a college or university. Campus climate, I say there's mixed perceptions because we've actually found in some of our research, including some of my own research, that there is still a lot of racial microaggressions going on HSIs, right? That's the reality because these are historically white institutions, right? I write about in an article about how there's pockets, right? Which we probably all know that, right? And you all probably start to navigate the spaces, right? Where you're like, over here, it's really great, and I'm validated in all sorts of ways. My identities are validated, and I like it. I feel good here. Over here in this other place, like in my science class, I don't know, I'm just gonna throw science under the bus, I don't feel so good, right? Like I actually am aggressed, right? There's faculty members who aggress me, right? Or in any certain little pocket, right? Political science or English or whatever it may be that you're like, yeah, there's some problems going on there, and I feel like there's racial microaggressions going on, right? And over here, sort of neutral, right? I don't feel aggressed, but I don't feel super validated either, right? And so there's different pockets, right, on college campuses. And that's important for us to notice and recognize, right? That like, how do we make it so that the entire campus is free of racial microaggressions, right? Not just pockets, right? People shouldn't have to navigate the spaces so that over here they feel good and over here they just sort of like, let me avoid it as much as I can, right? That's not a good place for people to be. We want the entire campus to be, welcoming and free of aggressions, of any type of microaggressions or outright aggressions. And then culturally relevant practices. So there's a lot of folks talking about how it's important to have culturally relevant curriculum and also culturally relevant programs. Now, this study, I don't know if I have it up there, there's a study that actually shows that only about 3% of the curriculum at all HSIs is ethnocentric. All right, 3%. That's a little bit, right? A small, tiny bit, right? So I write a little bit about this and talk about how do you put these different ways of knowing into all of your curriculum, right? It shouldn't just be in ethnic studies, right? And that's what we tend to do. We're like, well, they're doing it over there in ethnic studies, so we're good. I'm in psychology, it's cool. I'll just keep teaching the white normative ways, it's cool, right? Science, okay, engineering, math, whatever, microbiology, just the same sort of ways, right? I don't have to do anything because ethnic studies is doing it, right? That can't be the case. Right? That can't be the case. So again, how do you get the entire campus to shift so that everybody doesn't have to go to ethnic studies to feel like their ways of knowing are validated, right? You should feel like your ways of knowing are validated in science, right? And that in science, there's conversations about outcomes that are beneficial for your population, right? And that's hard. That's hard to do, right? Because faculty in all these different areas haven't been trained to do that. Right? And so that's where it gets really challenging, I think, for campuses. Is like, how do we disrupt the curriculum, the very white normative curriculum? How do we disrupt that, right? For me, I would argue that would get you to HSI, really, right? Really thinking about how do you disrupt the entire curriculum, right? A math class can be culturally relevant. It can, right? But those math faculty got to think about how do you do that, right? So that folks don't have to just take ethnic studies to feel like they're validated, right? So there's a lot of work being done around the importance of that, but we got a lot of work to do if only 3% of the curriculum at all HSIs is ethnocentric. What they call in the article they call it ethnocentric. I wouldn't call it that, but that's what they call it. I'd say culturally relevant maybe. So let me get into the typology a little bit. So I basically wrote this article in the American Educational Research Journal, and I proposed these different ways of being an HSI, right? And so this is this idea that to be an HSI doesn't just look like one thing, right? I think people are at a point where they want a checklist, right? They're like, well, just tell us what we need to do. If we do these 10 things, we'll be an HSI. And that's not the case, right? Every campus is gonna look different, and every campus starts in at one place and ends in another place, and that's okay, right? So this article I proposed as typology. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about it, and I'll tell y'all where I think you're at. Based on just what I've heard today, I'll tell you where I think I'm at, and I'll show you some of the empirical work I've done on this already. But let me talk about these two different guiding theories, right? So in this article, I talk about these two theories, right? And so I talk about this idea of institutional theory. Now, institutional theory is, in the org world, is basically where we say that all organizations act like all other organizations, right? That's basically at its core. It's really super complicated. It comes out of sociology, and it's been theorized in all sorts of ways, but that's its core argument, that organizations act like other organizations, right? So if I asked you to name your peer institutions, you probably could, right? Who are your peer institutions? UCLA. Everybody wants to be UCLA. Who else? UC Riverside. Okay. Anybody else? Where? Berkeley? Okay. I like how y'all all keep it within the system, UCs, we want to be like the UCs, right? Because the UCs are great. Why would you want to go out to the UCs, right? But you might say the University of Michigan, right? Or University of Virginia, right? Other large public universities, right? That are known to be really great public universities, right? But that's this. That's institutional theory, that every organization is going to try to be like another organization. They're aspirational, right? And you only want to be a little bit aspirational. And you don't want to take a leap, right? You're just we're almost UCLA, but we're just a little bit below UCLA for whatever reasons, right? So it's something you actually could achieve, right? And so that's what institutional theory is this is how we operate. We want to be like other institutions, or in post-secondary, we want to be like other higher education institutions, right? And the second theory that I pull on is is this idea of culture, right? Organizational culture. Now, this body of literature says we don't want to be like other institutions. We actually want to be like ourselves. We want to be a little bit unique, right? We want to look a little bit different than other folks, right? So they're two different arguments, really, that like we all try to be like each other, or no, we try to be really unique. We want to stand out as a unique institution, right? And so I use these theories. I'm not going to go into all the like details of the research context and all that, to propose this typology, right? And so this typology, basically what I talk about is that on this axis right here, this is the institutional theory. And this is based on like empirical data. Like I talk to folks and I'm like, what does it mean to be an HSI? What does it mean to be an HSI? What does it mean to be an HSI? And over like almost everybody, like 95% of the folks that I ask that, they say, it means we graduate students. We graduate Latinx students in equitable numbers, right? That's like, we're gonna graduate students. That's what we wanna do, right? So that's this idea of institutional theory, that we wanna be like other institutions, right? We don't wanna be unique in any other way. We wanna graduate students, right? That's what post-secondary institutions do. We wanna graduate students, right? In the article, I talk about two other important outcomes that people talk about, and one is post-baccalaureate enrollment, right? And the other is careers, getting jobs, right? And that's something I think is really not talked about. I would say arguably in y'all's grants, not really talked about. Outcomes I would encourage y'all to think about, right? Is like, do people graduate and get jobs? Do they get viable jobs? Do they get good jobs? Do they get jobs that they can then go and support their families, right? Because we know that like a lot of minoritized communities are gonna stay connected to their families and gonna go back and contribute back to their families, right? So are they graduating and getting jobs that are gonna help contribute and help their families to advance, right? If we're not graduating students that get good jobs, then guess what? We probably aren't doing a very good job, right? We're not doing a very good job of serving them, right? Also, this idea of post-baccalaureate enrollment was important for folks, and getting folks to think about the fact that their master's programs do not mirror their undergraduate programs, right? So their master's programs suddenly get really white, right? They're like, yeah, we're not doing very good because our psych program over here, the master's program, is all white students, right? And that becomes also a pocket of aggressions, right? Because it's all students who are like, the one student of color is like, I'm the one student of color, right? And they're getting aggressed and microaggressed, right? In sort of different ways. So that was an important thing for people to, like, in this study, to be like, yeah, we should be graduating them, and then they go on and get master's degrees and doctoral degrees, right? And we'll talk a little bit about how the numbers of faculty and staff don't match the student population, and that's part of the problem, is because we're not sending them into master's and doctoral programs, right? So it's like, we gotta start thinking beyond the undergraduate level, right? As far as outcomes, important outcomes. It can't just be getting a degree, right? 4-year degree, cool. Guess what? Most of your students, a lot of your students are gonna get the degree, right? But what happens next, right? What happens after that? That really would show effectively you're serving the students, right? So that's this continuum. Then this one is the culture. This axis is the culture, right? So folks talk about, well, we're a great place for Latinx students because we have a resource center, and we have EOP, and we have Chicano studies, and we have all these things. So we're a good place, right? We're a good place for Latinx students, and that gets into the sort of idea of culture, right? And so I put these together, and I like propose these different types, and I'll go into each of them, right? So the first one is, I put Latinx enhancing first. Interesting. So this one, this idea of an enhancing institution, I've written a lot about. And this is this idea that, like, yes, they meet the minimum enrollment requirement, 25%, and then they do a really great job in, like, the culture, right? The culture feels good. There isn't a lot of microaggressions going on. There's cultural programs. There's EOP. There's places that, like, people feel like they belong, like the institution reflects them, right? That's an institution that is enhancing. I might have skipped enrolling. I might have skipped my Prezi. The next quadrant, if I go too fast, then I go, Latinx producing. This is an interesting one. And when I first started this work, I wasn't sure if I was actually gonna find this, and I have found this using like quantitative IPEDS data, which I'll show you in the next slides. This is an institution that enrolls the minimum amount of Latinx students and also graduates them in equitable numbers. But they don't do a very good job on culture. Like, essentially, they're race neutral, right? They are Latinx neutral. There's no curriculum, there's no programs, there's no nothing. I have spent a lot of time in an institution like this in Chicago. Nothing. They say, we serve all students equally, right? Everybody's the same. right? We're all the same. We don't see race. It's one of those, it's kind of like all lives matter kind of institution. That's what this could be called, the all lives matter institution, right? All lives matter, Gina. We don't just serve Latinx students differently, right? Which I argue is problematic, right? Students need different things, right? Based on whatever their minoritized identities are, they need different things. They need to see themselves in the curriculum, right? And when I talk to students at this institution, they're like, yeah, that'd be cool. I wish I would see myself in the curriculum. That'd be great. I wish there was a resource center. That'd be awesome, right? But they're not, right? But guess what? They're graduating them in really high numbers and they're getting jobs, right? So that's important, but they're doing it in this sort of race-neutral way, right? Latin, oh, now I'm going like all kinds of ways. Serving, see, I never got to enrolling. I think I skipped it. Oh, maybe it's not there. So enrolling is basically this idea that like you just enroll a lot of students, but you don't graduate them well, and you don't enhance their cultural or racial ways of knowing, right? It's interesting because Latinx enrolling has almost become like nobody wants to be that. Like I go to places and they're like, oh yeah, we're not Latinx enrolling. No, we don't want to be that, right? It's like almost this derogatory sort of thing, right? That just enrolling a good amount of students, a large percentage of Latinx students isn't enough, right? And everybody sort of agrees that's not enough, right? And so people don't really want to be that. And then I propose this like Latinx-Serving is where like you come together and you do both. Right? You're graduating students, they're getting jobs, they're going on to post-baccalaureate degrees, they're getting PhDs later on in life, you're doing that, they're doing that, and also they had this really great validating experience where they got to learn about who they are racially, they got to think about it, it was in their curriculum, there wasn't just pockets, it was kind of all over the place, right? They felt like they could be their whole selves all the time, right? That would be this idea of Latinx serving, right? Now, I would say, I'll share that I think the UC system is probably most likely to be in this quadrant, right? All the UCs that are becoming HSIs, because y'all have sort of historically been doing the work around racially minoritized folks, right? I'm not saying you're perfect, right? You could probably be doing better, but there's some structure in place for doing this work, right? I wouldn't say y'all are race neutral, right? And also, your outcomes are pretty good, right? Because you're the UC. Right, y'all are the cream of the crop, right? Like you're admitting the people who have a really good chance of graduating, right? So I argue that, like, because people ask, like, well, do you see anybody in that quadrant? I'm like, I think the UCs are going to be in that quadrant, right? The UCs are definitely set up to be in that quadrant if they're not there yet already. So that's good for y'all. I think y'all can be in that quadrant of doing both. I think there's work to be done, right? Particularly around different kind of outcomes. Today we talked about in our meeting earlier about non-normative outcomes. Right? That like critical consciousness might be an important outcome for students. Maybe graduating them, yeah, that's important, but we want them to go out and be critically conscious, right? We want them to be aware of oppressive structures in this country, right? And that they know how to deal with them and disrupt them, right? How do you disrupt oppressive structures when you get out there? What's my time? I should have told y'all to give me a time check. I got 20 minutes? Okay, cool, I'll just keep talking. I gotta make sure, because otherwise I'll just keep talking. Y'all, I could keep talking all day, seriously. I'll try not to, but because I want to let y'all ask me questions as well. So I got into this testing of the typology, right? So I proposed this typology, and then I was like, well, let's see if it works, right? Can we actually use it in practice and in research, right? And so I have this project right now in the Midwest. I say the Midwest, but it's really Chicago, right? So I work with HSIs in Chicago. Chicago's the only place where there's Latinx people, all right? There's like 1 million of them there in Chicago, right? And then everywhere else in the Midwest is not very brown yet. I say yet because they're definitely starting to sprawl out a lot. So I looked at HSIs in Chicago. Been working with 3 HSIs in Chicago for the past 2 years, right? And I say working with them because I've been out there with them trying to figure out what do we do, right? How do we be better? How do we be better HSIs while collecting data? And so I looked at the typology. Again, I'm not going to get into like the details of all the stuff, but I collect a lot of data. I do case studies as far as in my research, so I go in and I collect a lot of data on one case, right? I'm like, give me everything. I want to know everything about this place. I want to know historically who you are. I want to know who you are now. I want to know if you got classes that fit into this like culturally relevant classes, right? I like gather lots and lots of data on these institutions. And then I moved on to classify them, right? And so I started with 6 in Chicago. There are 6 4-year HSIs in Chicago. At the time, there were 4 HSIs and 2 emerging HSIs who were right on the cusp of becoming HSIs. So they're classified as EHSIs. You can see their percentages, 23 and 24%. And so what I looked at was their undergraduate population, students of color undergrads, Latinx graduate students, and the students of color graduate. And this is why I really started to think about that idea that HSIs aren't doing a very good job at the graduate level, right? And I've heard y'all aren't doing a very good job at the graduate level, right? This is kind of normal, right? This is what HSIs, so we spend a lot of time at the undergraduate level, and at the undergraduate level, that's what identifies you as an HSI. You gotta have 25% at the undergraduate level. But graduate programs, as you can see, are not matching, right? That top institution, does this have a pointer? Maybe, I don't know. That top, oh yeah, all right. The top institution, you can see 35% Latinx undergrads and only 14% at the graduate level, right? That's something to think about. That's a huge disparity, right? That your graduate population is not mirroring your undergraduate population, right? This institution, let's see, this one is a research university, 24% Latinx and only 9% at the graduate level. Right? So what are we doing at the graduate level to think about how we are coming to serve Latinx people, right? And so this was really important, I think, finding just that alone, just being like, hey, we keep talking about how faculty and staff don't reflect the undergraduate population, but our graduate students don't reflect the undergraduate population either, right? And like I said, I've heard that y'all are in that same place, and I see some head shaking. Some of y'all are probably graduate students and like, yep, I'm in a white space. I'm in a white space, right? That's the reality is I'm at an HSI in a very white, small space in my graduate program, right? So that's important to think about, and I would encourage y'all to start thinking about, like, what are we gonna do to make these numbers match, right? There shouldn't be such huge disparities there. What's the next one? So what I did to look at the outcomes axis was I pulled graduation data for these 6 institutions, right? And so I looked at 6-year graduation rates because that's generally what we use to measure whether or not students were graduated them in a decent amount of time, which is 6 years, 150% time. And then I pulled them for Latinx students, compared them to white students, and then I also looked at completion rates because we know that at HSIs you're getting people who are transferring in. And when they transfer in, they don't get counted in the 6-year graduation rate, right? So your numbers start to get really skewed for institutions, particularly that are bringing in a lot of transfer students, right? So your numbers might be a little bit skewed, and you might be graduating students at much higher rates, but they're not being captured in the 6-year graduation rates, right? When using this IPEDS, or Institutional Post-Secondary Educational Data System, which I'm sure the IR people in the room, they're very familiar with the IPEDS data, right? But these are data like for each institution, very, very numerical data that we can sort of see what's going on and get a snapshot of the institution. And so I found like right here, it was like, yikes, look at their graduation rates are about 20%, right? That's pretty low. The national average is just under 50%, like 46% is national average for all post-secondary institutions. So this one, 20% for all students is very, very low, right? So this would be an institution that immediately would be like, I think they're Hispanic enrolling, right? They're a Latinx enrolling institution because all they're doing is just enrolling a lot of students, but they're never getting out, right? And you can see there's some disparities, racial disparities as well, but they're not graduating white students at very high rates either, right? They're not doing very well at all, and they know it. This institution, almost equitable, right? This is an institution and also above the national average, so they're doing a really good job, right? This one, also not that high, right? But they're also complicated. I'm gonna get into them in a little bit. This one, right at the national average, this one's above, and this one's right at the national average, right? So some of them, like 4 out of the 6, I'm like, hey, they're doing pretty good, right? I guess when you compare to national averages, right? Y'all are above all of these, I heard today. So just so you know, y'all are doing a pretty good job. But there is some inequities, and there continues to be inequities here and in other places between racial groups, right? So when you clump everybody together, it looks good. When you disaggregate, it doesn't always look good. Your black students and your Latinx students are always gonna be graduating at lower numbers, right? Not always, you could fix that, right? But for the most part, we always see those 2 populations for sure, right? Also some other API populations. Also, when you start to disaggregate your APIs, guess what? You got some huge disparities, right? When you start disaggregating those numbers as well. And if you have a large enough native population, hopefully you do, to disaggregate those numbers, you'll also see disparities, right? And that's just nationally what we're seeing. So disaggregation, which I heard y'all are doing here, is really important so we can see the racial disparities. I did see some differences in completion. Like this institution, it matches, their enrollment's about 24% and they're graduating. About 24% of their graduating class is Latinx, right? So I thought that was important. This one, it was really low. And so I was like, that's interesting. So I went through all these data. Oh, wait, first let me do that culturally relevant one. And then I went and I looked at their culturally relevant practices. Do they have curriculum? Do they have ethnic studies programs? Do they have women's studies programs, right? Do they have queer studies, right? I looked at like all these different ways in which they might be centering minoritized voices, and I found that a lot of them aren't. This is the neutral folks. These are the race neutral and neutral in a lot of ways, right? Gender neutral, like all sorts of just not centering non-dominant voices, right? These are places where we're just going with the norm, normative. The programs, the curriculum is normative, right? In all sorts of ways, right? And so only these two institutions, this one, ACU and RRU, came out as having some pretty good programming going on, right? They have cultural centers and resource centers and different programs for minoritized populations. Oh, there it goes again, messing up. And so I classified them into this typology, right? Bringing it back to typology. And I'm like, okay, this one right here, based on all those things, they're Latinx enrolling, right? They got some work to do, like on both these axes. These two up here, they're actually producing in pretty high numbers, but they're in this very neutral way, right? They're not centering minoritized voices, right? These two over here, they're doing a great job in centering the minoritized voices, but they're not doing well in graduating students or producing other outcomes. This one up here, this is an anomaly. So I gotta tell you about this institution. This institution was actually founded as an HSI. They are an English-Spanish bilingual institution, right? One of like two in the whole country. So they're sort of different, and their completion rates don't actually look like they're doing that well, but they are, because they're a different institution, right? They're a 4-year institution, but they mostly have associate's degrees, right? They have like 4 or 5 bachelor's programs. They're a really small institution. So they just have become an anomaly in my study, and they're fascinating. And I'm excited to share their story, and they want me to share their story. But they have bilingual curriculum. Right? Their curriculum is bilingual and is transitional bilingual. They bring in people into the institution that don't speak English, right? And they put them into this curriculum and they get them to speak English in like 4 classes, right? And they get them into this curriculum in their like social work program that's bilingual, right? And so there's a lot of bilingual stuff going on in their campus. So they're just an anomaly, right? And so writing about them is interesting because I try to think, how does an institution like y'all's institution learn from them, right? You're not a bilingual institution. You're probably never going to be a bilingual institution, but how do you learn from that sort of program, right? Like, how do you think about, like, how do we center people's languages, right? People's languages matter. Right? How do we center that in an English program, right? In an English class where we allow people to write in their native languages, right? Maybe people want to write bilingually in their English, and maybe not English, composition, right? Because composition is in English, right? Composition, but being able to write effectively in multiple languages, right? And not just centering one language, right? So there's things like that we can learn from an institution like this that allows that to happen in the classroom. Right? They let that happen in the classroom, and they let that happen in their writing, right? And in the sort of assignments that are coming out. So something to learn from all institutions, even if they are sort of an anomaly, because they historically are an HSI, right? So moved on to the next study where I basically narrowed it down to 3 of those 6. And I said, okay, I'm gonna spend more time in these 3 institutions, right? And so I went in and started asking people, what does it mean to be an HSI? What do you think it means to be an HSI? To validate this typology, to think about, like, what does it mean, and is it still on these 2 continuums? Is it still institutional theory? Is it still cultural theory, right? Like, do y'all construct your identity in that sort of way as well? And I'll share briefly some of the findings. This is like not out. We just, me and my grad students just did a paper a month ago, and that's it. It's not out in the world yet. So I'm happy to share the findings with y'all. But these are the 3 institutions. The names should look familiar because they were the names from the 6, right? I narrowed down the 6 to 3. And you can see they're very different, including, which one did I say? Amarillo Private College, that's the HSI, the historically HSI, right? So they have a large Latinx population. They're bilingual curriculum. They're founded as to serve the Latinx community. They're just a unique institution altogether. So these are the 3 institutions, and they looked very different. And I originally classified this one as Latinx producing, this one as serving, and this one as enhancing. And what I found was that when they were given the ability to construct their own identity and say who they are, it was a little bit different. Like my imposed identity on them was a little bit different than what they constructed, right? And so I like to think about that as like, if I went around the room and I was like, well, how do you identify racially? And you're like, I'm white. And I'm like, no, you're not, you're Latina. How do you identify? I'm black. No, you're not, you're white, right? And I tell you what you are, but you're like, but no, this is my identity, right? This is who I am. And I'm like, no, I'm just gonna tell you who you are because I can, right? Because I'm doing research and it tells me that you are, right? That's what we're doing with HSIs, essentially. At a policy level, we're saying, you're an HSI if you do X, Y, and Z, right? And in this work, I'm saying, well, actually, what if we just let the folks at the HSI decide who they are, right? That an HSI, what it means for us to be an HSI, it looks like this, right? And the HSI identity is super complicated, right? Just like to be black is complicated, to be Asian is complicated, to be Latinx is complicated, to be white is complicated, right? It's super complicated, and not every person identifies the same way within those different racial categories. And so that was something that was really important finding with this study, was that like, well, what I say they are and what they say they are different. And I need to listen to them, right? Because they're the HSI, not me. I'm just a researcher collecting data, right? And so I'll show you what that looks like here with the findings. So they talk about their ideal HSI identity, right? And this looks different for all of them. Like this institution, the historical HSI, all they talk about is being bilingual. That's the only thing that matters to them. That makes them an HSI. We're bilingual, we're an HSI. Those two things, that's all that matters. They didn't talk about outcomes at all. They don't talk about jobs, they talk about being bilingual. We're bilingual, we're an HSI. That's it. We're an HSI because we're bilingual. I'm like, okay, that makes sense, right? These two sort of mirrored each other in a lot of ways, right? This one really stressed job placement. Students get jobs. If students get jobs, we're an HSI. If Latinx students get jobs, we're an HSI, right? We're doing a good job. They also talked about faculty and staff mirroring the student population. That was important to them because they knew that wasn't happening, right? And then having these like culturally relevant programs. Now, that's what they thought ideal was. When I give them the opportunity to say, who are you actually right now? Because they get to idealize, right? And that if I asked all of y'all, what would it mean if you actually were an HSI? You will all tell me all these ideal indicators, right? If we did this, we'd be an HSI. If we did that, we'd be an HSI. And then I get into like, well, but who are you right now? Tell me who you are right now. And then they're like, oh, well, we do this really well. So this institution over here, they're like, oh, we offer experiential learning. That's part of our core identity. It has nothing to do with being an HSI, but they're like, but we do this, and we do it really well, right? And they're like, we have holistic advising. We do such a good job with advising. That's why students graduate, because we have great advising practices. I'm like, okay, so that makes you an HSI, but you didn't say that was your ideal identity, right? We didn't say that because that's that institutional theory, right? We say that we'd be a good institution when we graduate students, right? Because that's what the society tells us as post-secondary institutions we should do, right? But in reality, we do graduate students, but only because we're really good advising, right? We have a great holistic advising model. And so I bring that together and be like, okay, so how does that lead to the ideal, right? But this is what they said they were really good at. They said, we're bilingual. We're really good at that. We also they did get into like, oh, we prepare students for jobs. And we prepare them to go out and work in the Latinx community. That was important to them. And then they said, we're a good environment. But that was connected to being bilingual. They're like, people can come here and they can speak Spanish, and it's great. It's great for them. They like it here, right? And then this institution said, you know what, we provide access for lots of people, undocumented students, poor students, low-income students. They just named all these students that they provided access for, and that was important, that they provided that, and that was part of their core identity. And then they also had a lot of programs. This was the Latinx enhancing institution, right? They provide a lot of programs for Latinxes, and then they engaged with the community. They thought that was important, and that's what they do really well. Right? Even if they're not graduating students, they're like, we do that really well, right? We work with the community. We have a site that's located in a Latinx community, right? And we work with the community in that site, right? That's one of our branch campuses, and that's an important branch campus, right? So those sort of things were important to them. That's a quote, if you wanted to read the quote from the study. So I talked about this idea of imposed identity versus co-constructed. Right, that if you allow folks to construct their own identity, it's going to look different than what I would impose as a researcher, or the federal government imposes, or anybody imposes, right? And so really getting us to think about like, whose place is it to decide what it means to be an HSI, right? And I argue that it's your place, right? That it's the HSIs, right? We're going to decide what this identity means for us, just like you decide who you are racially, or what your gender identity is, right? Your sexual identity, right? Your income identity, right? Like we have all these social classes, right? Social identities, and you get to decide that, right? And so as an institution, I'd say you get to decide that, right? Y'all get to decide that as a group. And how do you center everybody's voices in that decision? Because what I said and what they said were different, and that's what this graph shows. I think I talked about that already, ideal versus current. So yeah, basically at the end of this, I was like, okay, the typology works, right? And I would encourage your HSI team to think about the typology and place yourselves in there. I think y'all are probably up in the top quadrant. You're probably doing a good job, but you might find that you're not doing a lot as far as like enhancing, right? Maybe you need to do some more work there, and maybe you need to define outcomes differently, right? Like, and not be such a norm, focusing always on the normative, what I call normative, which is graduating students, right? What happens after that? What happens to students after you graduate them, right? And what do you want them to do? I don't know what you want them to do, but that's for you to decide, right? So using the typology, and also in this article, we talk about just, this is one identity of many, right? So not getting so caught up in like being an HSI is limiting in other ways. You can be an HSI and you can be a Black serving institution, you can be an PZ, you can serve lots of communities, right? You can do all sorts of things and be a research university, right? And be a this and a that and all these sorts of things that you are, right? Whatever it is, public, research university, right? Like you can be those things and be an HSI. It's just one of many of your identities, right? So don't get so caught up. I see HSIs like beating themselves up, right? Like, we're not an HSI because we're not doing X, Y, Z. You are. You're getting there, right? It's a progression, right? And it is one of many identities. So embrace it as one. I made my time. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop there and let y'all like ask questions. Are you gonna,
Thank you so much. So we want to give now the opportunity for all of you. We have been doing public forums, and we did share with Dr. Garcia that we've been engaging the community, really, one, telling the story in the sense of the grant writing and everything, but really where we're moving, where we're at, and I think those public forums serve in the sense of the co-constructing this identity, right? But now, so we want to give the opportunity for questions. Anybody has a question or comment, reflection? You're like, uh-huh.
I saw like a lot of head nodding.
And if you can say your name and your pronouns, and perhaps if you're staff, faculty, a retiree, or part of the co-chair alumni network, please let us know.
Part of the what?
Welcome, good afternoon.
Thank
My name
you.
is Richard Vasquez. I'm the co-coordinator of the Latino Alumni Network. I used to work here, and so my concern and question, particularly dealing with staff, particularly staff of color. There are no, other than Pablo, there are no other ranking staff on this campus.
Yes.
If I'm a new staff of color, who am I to emulate?
Right.
In terms of leadership,
Right,
both male and female. There's nothing.
right.
So I just wanted to ask that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I didn't really talk about it in the talk. And we talked about this early in our meeting, this idea of that we're gonna have to start to grow our own. I call them grow our own programs, which is the thing. We talk about growing our own teachers, right? There's a lot of work in urban ed scholarship about growing your own teachers. And I think that HSIs needs to start thinking about that. And I think it's connected to the master's and doctoral programs, right? Getting your students to get bachelor's degree and not stopping there, right? To getting your students, to convincing them that they move right into master's programs and doctoral programs, right? Because we're gonna have to grow our own because the numbers are just small, right? Like we don't have the numbers, but it doesn't mean we can't. So I work with this HSI in Chicago, and they have a program called Enlace, right? And their Enlace program is just that. It's a master's program in education, and it's a higher ed program. And they're training campus administrators, and they provide scholarships for Latino students, and those students come in and they go through the program fully funded, and the program talks about being an HSI, being a minority serving institution. They talk about basically training administrators to go out and work in minority serving institutions, right? It's a great program. I encourage you to look into it. Enlace, it's at Northeastern Illinois University, and that's what they do, right? I haven't seen very many programs like that, but it's an idea, right? That we start thinking about that and start partnering with other institutions that do that already and getting them to think about how can we transform that higher ed administrator curriculum so that it's training folks to go work in minority serving institutions, right? We're gonna have to start to grow our own, right? And it's gonna have to be a really collaborative effort, right? Like where are those folks, where are Latino students going into master's programs? Because they're out there, and how do we get them to be, at our administrative level? And also faculty, right? Like being much more intentional in faculty recruitment. I was talking about earlier, my dean, I have a new dean, and my dean is really great, and she's all about equity and justice, and she told us that our searches this year, we have 4 searches, faculty lines, and she said, basically, if you don't give me a list with people of color on it for the final 3 people that come to campus, we're shutting down your search. Your search is not happening. If you give me your top 3 people are all white folks doing normative work, we're shutting it down. That's what needs to happen. We need deans to say that. Like, you need to start giving me people that think differently, look differently, act differently, right? Or we're shutting down your search, right? That's what's gonna have to start to happen, is at the high administrative levels, we can't continue to allow us to bring in the same folks that do the same sort of thing, right? We need folks to come in that think about the population. Remember that population, HSI population? That's important. We need folks that are gonna come in and think about the fact that you are teaching and mentoring people of color, low-income people, people undocumented status, people from mixed status families, right? All these sort of things. Do you understand what that means? And if you don't, we don't want to hire you, right? So it's gonna have to be a really super intentional effort that, like, administrators on this campus are gonna have to decide to do that, right? Mm-hmm. We can't hear you. Mm-mm.
Hello, I'm Amanda Smith. I'm faculty in literature. I also work primarily in the Spanish Studies program, which is sort of a microcosm of what you were talking about, Amarillo. It's actually all in Spanish, the curriculum. And along the lines of what you were just saying, I was wondering, it seems like your research is mostly descriptive and you're not making recommendations per se, but I was wondering if you've also seen at the administrative level, as these demographics change and as we try to genuinely think of ourselves as a Hispanic serving institution, if you've seen at the administrative level changes in the way faculty are evaluated, in terms of the way that shifts the labor that's required to actually serve the students that we have here.
Good question. No, that's not happening. But I do, so in the Decolonizing HSIs article, I encourage y'all to look at that article. That article basically I lay out 9 aspects of the university. And I say, if you address these 9 elements, it'll help you progress, right? And one of them is reward structures, right? The reward structure is super important. That, like, if people are not rewarded to do what I would call anti-racist, anti-oppressive, decolonized work, they're not gonna do it. They aren't, all right? And faculty are the worst. And I'm a faculty member, so I can say it. Faculty will not jump if you don't reward us, right? You want me to jump? You want me to stand on one foot? Nope. If I'm not gonna get tenure for doing it, I'm not gonna do it, right? I'm not gonna do it. So until I'm rewarded for it, I'm not gonna do it, right? So, but that's at every level. Faculty, and you're gonna have to disaggregate like tenure stream and non-tenure stream and part-timers and full, all those folks need to be rewarded, right? But your administrators need to be rewarded too, right? Like at every level, folks need to be rewarded, whatever that reward looks like, to do this work. Right? And like I said, in the Decolonizing HSI article, I call it anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and decolonized work, right? That we need to reward people to do this. And we talked about in our meeting earlier that could look a lot of ways. Rewards are not always money, right? They're not monetary, right? But like how people are evaluated. Student evaluations, that's a place where you could definitely like rethink like how people are evaluated, right? Like, are people, like when you reward people for not being racist in a classroom, then they'll move towards not being racist, right? But until you call it that, they're gonna keep saying like, I'm not racist, really? Because we could find ways in which you are, right? Ways in which all of us are. The curriculum is oppressive in many, many ways, right? So until people are rewarded and evaluated for those things, they're not gonna change it, right? So yeah, reward structure is huge. What a major area that folks are gonna have to do, but I have not found any university that I've worked with that has done that work yet. So y'all could be that one. Y'all could be the trailblazers. will come here.
We can be the leaders in that.
You can be the leaders in that. Y'all want to be a model. I already know because I already sat with the HSI team. I'm like, y'all want to be like the model HSI over here. So you want to be the model? Start to decolonize your practices, right? Start to really think about your practices in ways that like are going to be anti-oppressive. More questions? You have a question? I see you like.
Can I, so she'll ask the question, then you'll ask the question, because she needs to go and she really wants to ask.
Okay.
Andrea Vasquez. I'm a graduate coordinator for El Centro, so I appreciated your talk on support for graduate students. I was just wondering, well, I had two questions. The first one was, what would be some ways that we can do that as an HSI? Because it's a struggle for us, right, to think about how we're going to support our graduate students. And then the other one, I'm thinking about the diaspora of what it means to be Latinx, right? And I'm thinking, I guess, how do we as an institution use this title to leverage our other communities? But yeah, I don't know if that's a...
Yeah, that's like two totally different questions. So let me see if I can address both of those. I haven't thought a lot about the graduate education because in that study, that was the first time I really noticed it, right? And I think that's sometimes where you have to start, right? Just noticing, right? Like, so the conversations I've already had today we were having that conversation about like, yeah, we're noticing at the graduate level, we're not reflective of the undergraduate population, right? That's like step one, right? Like first you gotta notice it, right? You gotta notice that it's even a problem. So disaggregating, I know y'all are disaggregating numbers in all sorts of ways, disaggregating those data, right? And starting to look at, well, where are we doing better and where are we not doing better, right? Like if you disaggregate your graduate numbers, you're probably also gonna find that the people of color are in like 5 programs, and then the other however many graduate programs are there's no people of color, right? So like disaggregating and also seeing where the spots are that you need to address is also important, right? Because if you just sort of look at the data all together, you might find like, oh, we're not doing that bad, right? But you probably are in certain areas, right? So I think just noticing, disaggregating the data, and then also, I mean, with graduate students, you gotta support them, right? Like economically, graduate students at the master's and at the doctoral level, you can get funding, right? You can get funding in lots of places. So are you providing that funding structure? Right? Like I tell students that I have a master's degree in college student personnel, and my program was fully funded, right? And so anybody that asks me about going into a master's program, I'm like, do not go to a program that doesn't fully fund you. Don't do it. Because guess what? There's programs that will fully fund you, right? So if the programs aren't fully funding you and you got people like me saying, don't go there, don't stay at Santa Cruz because they're not giving you a package, go over here to the University of, I don't know, probably somewhere in the Midwest, because the Midwest is known for funding people of color because they want people of color to come, right? So going to the University of Illinois or wherever that's going to actually fund you, do it, right? Because they will fund you for graduate program. Don't go anywhere where they won't fund you. So I think that's going to be an important conversation, right, for y'all to have. Like, okay, we can look at our numbers, but also are we going to be able to support students, right, through the graduate program, both at the master's and the doctoral level, right? What was the second question?
If an HSI or having that title could be a leverage to support other communities.
Other communities that are not Latinx. Okay. Yes, so I think that's a big thing with HSIs and folks. As I go in and I talk to people about like, well, what does it mean to be an HSI? People are reluctant, particularly in California, to say that it means we serve one population. And I say particularly in California because we're an anti-affirmative action state, right? And I say we because I'm from here and I know, and that's been the historical, right? Like, I don't know that affirmative action is ever coming back in California at the admissions level. And so people are reluctant always to say we serve one population because it's against the law, right? Like, I mean, basically after 2009, we defunded all programs that were for particular populations, right? All those programs went away. I was in the minority business program. Next day, it's like the equity center. And I'm like, what happened to the minority business program, right? Like, you can't be minority anything all of a sudden, right? Minority engineering programs, business programs, all those were like either defunded or they changed their names, right? And they had to get funding from other places because you can't serve a particular population anymore. So people are really reluctant to say we only serve one population, right? And so I think that's an important part of your co-construction is realizing that the HSI thing doesn't mean you only serve one population, right? If anything, it's kind of like, this is where I might say HBCUs might be a good example. HBCUs are, they are what they are, and people go to them, but they also go to HBCUs knowing that those are good spaces for everybody. They're good spaces for minoritized people, right? So how do we get to a place where we recognize that HSIs are serving all students, right, well, and not just one population, right? My study that I'm thinking about now that I'm moving into doing a study with an institution in Boston, an HSI in Boston, the title of the study is about serving, rather than serving Latinx students, it's serving minoritized students, right? And getting the folks in Boston to think about how are we serving all students, right? And I always throw in like undocumented students. That's such a conversation, right, at HSIs in particular, like undocumented students, low-income students, Black students, Native students, right? Like I said, disaggregate your API students because you're going to find a lot of inequities in the API, when you start to disaggregate those numbers. So I think it's an opportunity, right, to be like, you know what, we're called an HSI, but that's just because the federal government told us. Just like the federal government told us we're Hispanics, right? But doesn't mean do you identify, right? They told us we're Hispanics, and I use Latinx, right? That's not even right. The X thing, that's only been in the last 2 years. All of a sudden, we decide we want to be Latinxes, so we're all gender inclusive. But the federal government told us we're Hispanics. They told us we're Hispanic Serving Institutions. It's just a federal designation. It doesn't really say who you are, right, at your core. So I think it's an opportunity to serve all populations better. Mm-hmm. Oh, over here and then over there.
So I wanted to ask, my name is Uriel, he, him, his, second-year doctoral student in the sociology department. So 2 questions. So first one is if you could speak more to the importance of faculty of color and staff of color in terms of the campus climate and HSIs beyond student outcomes or neoliberal ways of measuring how how good students are doing on campus, right? So just speaking more, because sometimes I think we get caught up in are we graduating or not, and not thinking about the other implications of the importance of having faculty of color and staff of color. And then the second one is, given that we are in California and that we can't, I don't think we could do, in terms of hiring practices, we can't say we need more we're restricted to these things. Do you have examples of maybe how an HSI identity could be leveraged or deployed to push against some of those things that kind of hold us back in positions of power, saying we need more faculty of color or we need more Black faculty at Santa Cruz because we have less than 5 who are tenure track, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say there's definitely research. My colleagues in education have been doing research on and finding strong correlations between faculty of color and the experiences of students, right? And some of it is quantitative and some of it is qualitative. That basically we keep finding that yes, faculty of color actually do different things for different students. One thing I kept talking about today that I didn't really unpack a lot is ways of knowing. Right, ways of knowing, and I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with that sort of thinking, but ways of knowing, a lot of that comes out of like Chicana feminist theory that I pull from, right, Gloria Anzaldua's work, stuff like that, queer women of color doing work around our ways of knowing, right, and that they're different than the dominant ways of knowing, right? And so I think what faculty do that becomes really important, faculty of color and staff of color, is they bring their ways of knowing into the classroom. And they bring their ways of knowing into programs, right, that they're running, and their ways of knowing into whatever it is that they're doing on the college campus. And that's different, right? It's different than the normative way of being. So, for example, I teach a history of higher education class, right? And I was I am not teaching the white man's perspective. I refuse, because I took history of higher education and it was the white man's perspective. I'm really? And then the people of color and the women and everybody we got 1 week. 1 week, which meant 1 day, because we only went to class 1 day, right? But we got the week, right? And that was it. And this was that, 10-week, it was quarter system. So 9 weeks of the white male perspective and 1 week of all the minoritized, right? And I was I'm not doing that. I'm flipping it upside down. And so every single week we talk about minoritized folks, and mostly we talk about how they've been excluded from institutions of higher ed the entire 400 years of institutions of higher ed, right? Harvard was founded in 1636. That's the 400 years, right? So since 1636, most of us in this room have been excluded and never been welcome in institutions of higher ed. Unless you're rich, white, male, this institution wasn't for you. No institution was for you, right? I don't know. Are there any rich white males out there? I don't see any, but I don't know. But most of us, right? Most of us were not, these spaces weren't intended for us. She's I'm done. Right? So I wasn't willing to teach that perspective, right? But you gotta have folks who are, first of all, conscious of that, right? Like I was conscious. I was like, I am not teaching that, right? Like I'm conscious of that white perspective and I'm not teaching it, right? And that can do it. And guess what? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to teach from the minoritized perspective. It's a ton of work, and I don't do it well for all minoritized groups. I know I don't. I'm like, right? Like, how am I gonna get a transgender perspective into the history of higher education? I don't even know, right? Nobody's even written that, but I gotta do it, right? Because if I don't do it, nobody else is gonna do it, right? So faculty of color and staff of color tend to do that. Minoritized folks do that because our ways of knowing are different. Right? So we bring something different to the university. Like there's research that shows that, right? Like we bring something completely different to the university. So I think that's important. As far as practices, like I said, I think at the high administrative level, it's gonna have to be at that level, right? That like folks are gonna be like, you know what? Yeah, don't show me that short list of all rich white males, right? Like, I don't want the short list of faculty or administrative positions to be that. Like, I'm gonna need to see different ways of knowing. And I think there's ways of doing it in California, right? Because you don't have this, it's not like a quota, it's not like saying we only want Latino people to apply, right? But just being aware, right? Being aware of who's actually in that pool and being aware that we evaluate CVs based on white normative ways of knowing, right? So how do you get a search committee that can be aware of that and understand that we gotta evaluate CVs in a way that we recognize different types of scholarship, right? And different ways of knowing, right? Because we got different ways of knowing. So I think I wanted to talk a little bit more about the ways of knowing, right? And what I meant by that, right? Because that's important, right? And those of you that are like in ethnic studies, like you probably, or like I said, feminist studies, you know that kind of language, right? Because it comes from that type of place, right? So disciplinary place. Mm-hmm. Oh no, you were just stretching? I know, it's like we're getting tired here, okay.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I really appreciated that. My name is Sylvain. I was an undergrad here and now I'm a grad student here. And so I had a question about, you talked a little bit about the campus culture and the campus climate. And you had mentioned like those pockets that students kind of retreat to, or and ideally the whole institution, we wouldn't need to have those pockets. But, right. In this case, I think we do have those pockets, and if we could identify those pockets, do you have any examples of how an HSI could learn from those pockets or support those pockets?
Yeah, so I wrote about this. So the place where I did my dissertation work actually did this in an amazing way. So y'all have an EOP program, right? Is EOP one place, or are there multiple EOPs? We're growing, okay, I just gotta ask so I know before I talk about this. Okay, good, no, that's good. So this place, their EOP program, I had to write about this, right? Because I was like, this is amazing, right? So their EOP program, first of all, their central EOP program, the office is across the hall, president's office, EOP office, okay? Location matters, right? If you put your EOP office in the basement of like whatever random building that nobody knows about, guess what? It shows that it doesn't matter, right? That shows that EOP does not matter, right? EOP, president's office, literally across, there's this hall and that's it. I could go to the EOP director's office or I could go to the president of the university's space, right? And it was a Cal State, so president meaning the highest person, right? Your chancellor, equal to your chancellor, right? That was powerful, just space, right? So that's their central EOP office. They have 8 colleges. Every single college has an EOP, and every single college has an EOP director. Every single college has EOP advisors, and they advise everybody. They're like, so our EOP students, they get EOP funding, yes, and then everybody else gets all the great things that EOP has to offer, right? So I thought that was such a great idea because it's this idea that something that's good for minoritized populations, which we would probably all agree EOP is good for low-income students and people of color, is good for everybody, right? Like it's good practices for everybody, right? It's good for the white male too, right? With money, right? It's good for that because EOP has this sort of high-touch type of practices, right? And so those have been proven to be good for students, minoritized students, so why not give that to everybody, right? And so the people that go through that EOP program, they don't even know. They're not EOP students, they just know that they go to that center in that college, which is their college, and they get advising, right? They don't necessarily know anything else beyond that, but it is at its core, it's the EOP program, right? And they're fully staffed in every single. So that, to me, is such an amazing model, right? And I haven't seen it, right? And it sounds like y'all maybe want to go towards that, but that would be the ideal, right? How many colleges y'all got? 8 colleges? 10 colleges? Every college has the EOP program, right? And it's no longer called the EOP program. It's just called advising, but we use imagine that, right? I had one institution, I say that because I had an institution, they're like, oh, well, that program, it has a bad name. Nobody wants to go to that because they think that they're minoritized. If you're in that program, you're a special admit. Nobody wants to be in that. I'm like, how about take the name away and give it to everybody, right? If you know that it's good, take the name away and everybody gets it, right? It's no longer a special admit program. It's the program that everybody goes to get advising. Right? So just changing names matters, right? Changing the way people think about certain programs like EOP or whatever that may be, right? I mean, EOP, it sounds like y'all believe in EOP, right? So why not give it to everybody, right? Why not give that to everybody? The other thing I talk about in that article is their Chicano studies program also was infused in their like you could take 3 of the 4 main classes that you have to take to graduate from Cal State, you could take from Chicano studies, right? 3 out of 4, and it would count. Right? Imagine that your core classes, your 4 core classes could happen in ethnic studies and could be taught from those ways of knowing, right? Why do you think I took all kinds of Chicana studies? I was at Cal State. I was like, yes, speech, yes, composition, yes, give it to me. History, I'll take it all. Anything that counts towards my degree, I'll take it from this way of knowing because I've never been taught from this way of knowing, right? So it was important. It was important to me and it's important to your students. So that's what I would say. I definitely encourage that kind of model.
So we have one more question from faculty Nandini. Come over here. And I actually want to take this question as well as just commend because Gina earlier in the morning with our meeting and then today, disruptive. I think she's calling for disrupting the curriculum, disrupting and not doing just everything traditionally and how it's done before. And I just want to say that faculty Nandini, that's what she does.
Thank you. So
she's an institutional agent. Institutional agents disrupt normative ways of being. So
yeah, disruptive is a good middle name for me. So my question to you is, so I see that the definitions, the way you are wanting us to structure our thinking in an HSI institution is not being confined in the barrier of the terminology of an HSI. And I often see that I do this to justify my work.
Right.
Like I say that we are doing this work as part of this HSI grant, almost like a justification, and not feeling very confident and proud, and somewhat like a sense of belonging that this is how it should be, and you also should be doing this.
Right.
So we need to kind of have the conversation, not like we are doing this work because we have this grant and it's really want us to do this work.
Right.
Like we're constantly justifying our action.
Yes.
And a specific example of that is this quarter I taught a math course, which is a gateway math course where traditionally a lot of students of color fail. And we have a 2-unit lab where they are writing about how mathematics is, you can look at social justice issues and quantitatively analyze how oppression is in a mathematical sense. So this is a very different way of looking at like how this course has been traditionally taught. But when I say I do this, I think it has unleashed a lot of learners' agency among my students. But in order to justify that this is indeed a mathematics course and not a writing course, not a statistics course, not a sociology course, not a psychology course, I'm constantly justifying.
Right.
So how do you not justify this?
Yes, that's a good question. So we talked about that also in our meeting earlier. I talked about this idea that as minoritized people, whatever your minoritized identities are, you constantly are having to perform to the dominant way, right? So if it's racially, you gotta act white. We have this idea of acting white, right? The only way you're gonna be successful is if you act white, right? Like women gotta do what men do, right? Like we gotta constantly be going to the dominant way of knowing. And like as minoritized people, I think that's where we're at, right? We're constantly trying to be like, well, if I actually gonna be successful, I have to fit in that, right? And I think that's what you're trying to say, right? Like that the only way people are gonna buy into it is if I say that it's legitimate, right? That this is actually a legitimate math class, right? And the legitimate means the norm normative way, right? The normative way that we've always bought into it, right? I also would call that, from a critical race perspective, interest convergence, right? I was thinking that earlier in our meeting, actually, like, gosh, so much interest convergence that has to happen. And for those of you that aren't familiar with like Derek Bell's work, Derek Bell is a critical race theorist who says that in order for white people to disrupt racism, it has to be to their benefit. So white people will not say, I'm going to disrupt racism until it benefits white people, right? That's interest convergence, right? And that's happened at different points historically, right? When white folks said, okay, this is problematic, we better do something about it, right? And that's the only time that people will actually act to disrupt oppressive structures, when it's beneficial to the dominant group to do so, right? When it looks good to the dominant group. And that's what I think is going on. That's what I heard a little bit earlier in some of the conversations we were having, is like, gosh, y'all are really having to find those ways to converge interests, right? Y'all are having to converge interests with the higher powers that be, and once you converge interests with them, they buy into what you're doing, right? That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work for minoritized people. We're constantly having to do that. We're constantly having to figure out, how do my interests converge with your interests so that you'll actually buy into what I'm doing, right? I don't know that I have an answer to it, but that's what's going on, right? Like, that's what I see going on for y'all, right? Until you're able to get folks at the top to be like, yeah, you know, this is actually good for everybody, you're going to constantly be having to do that, right? Which is problematic, right? And what do those folks want to see? They want to see the normative outcomes. They want to see the normative things going on, right? They also, what I heard, want to see you bringing grant money in, right? You bring in grant money, they let you do things, right? I tell my PhD students, once I got a PhD, I could pop off, right? Like, I could just go off. Until I got a PhD, I couldn't like speak my mind, right? Once I got a PhD, I could tell you about yourselves, right? Because all of a sudden I have the credibility, right? So we're constantly having it like, okay, I got a PhD, now I could pop off, right? I got a grant, now I could do whatever I want, right? Like, showing that students are graduating, I could do this different math class, right? We're constantly having to prove our credibility, right? And it's just not fair to us, right? To do that. I don't know that I have a good answer to how you don't have to do that. Yeah, I'm validating your experience, right? That's important, right? That's important, right? Like, validating people's experience and just being like, I feel you, right? This is a real experience, even though I don't have a good answer to how to not do it, right? But y'all are doing good. I think y'all are doing really well.
So let's thank Dr. Garcia again. So, thank you for validating what we are doing. We do it a lot with our, with our corazón, with our students, with our staff, with our faculty, with our community. But there's a lot of work to be done. And so we will invite you. So if you signed in, we have this sign-in sheet. We will send you an evaluation electronically. We want to get ideas of what public forums you want to see in the future. We really want to co-construct this identity, continue this dialogue. For those that were invited through the calendar, you all got the readings. We do have the reading that Dr. Garcia just mentioned. So if you signed up, we will send it to you. I probably will link it through Chisme if you're online as well through Chisme, and put it on our website. I know, that's our e-news.
Nice.
And I also want to thank
HSI, that's an HSI thing. When your e-news is called Chisme, it's a good indicator.
So I just want to also say that this was possible because Rene Moreno's instrumental logistical assistance. Gracias, Rene. He's our program coordinator. Jacob Velasquez, who's our interim program coordinator as well. El Centro interns and HSI intern Kim as well. Everybody, thank you so much for all your help for setting up. If you want to join any committees, I will pass this to Kim, and Kim is our HSI intern. If you want to be part of this committee or any other committees, we welcome anybody, and everybody wants to work. So come on in, and that's pretty much what I have. Thank you all for coming again.
Thank you all.